Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Susie Marsh Meffin, LCSW, that's a licensed clinical social worker. And this video is not meant to diagnose or treat any illness, but to edutain you, which is educate you and entertain you. So today we are talking about shame and abuse, or traumatic death, or death in of itself. Shame and guilt are very different. Guilt is when you feel bad about something that you did, and it's something you might be able to apologize for or somehow make up for it or make amends. So guilt is when you know you did something wrong, and usually it's your behavior. Shame is a feeling that somehow what happened to you was something that you deserved. Like, this wouldn't have happened if I wasn't such a bad person. Maybe somehow this was my fault. Maybe somehow I caused this to happen. So shame says, because of my true personality, this bad thing happened to me, or somehow because of me, this thing happened to me. And they usually don't end up blaming the situation on the abuser or what happened that caused the death or created the death. They blame it on themselves. And for me, this, during my brother's history of my brother, it was a very secret feeling that I really didn't let myself fully imagine until I was in therapy and was confronted with it and was able to heal it. It was like a secret I had. So shame and trauma, physical, sexual, emotional, psychological trauma, says that somehow I must have created something that made this happen to me. Somehow this was my fault. And if anything, God didn't rescue me from it, so that might be another reason why it's my fault. I want to touch on that for a second. I've never worked with anybody, including myself, that didn't feel like God somehow let this happen. And one of the things that helped me with that, and hopefully it will help you, is that in a Christian religion, we are taught that we are given free will. So these abusers and perpetrators are given free will. They have to choose to do that behavior and not try to stop. They have to make that choice. And that's what happens in Christianity, is we were given free will, and they chose to do that. God didn't make them do that. God didn't not rescue us because of it. They unfortunately did it, and it happens all the time, and many times. Thank goodness with the Me Too movement, we know how much more often it happens than we thought. Although therapists who work with trauma really were aware of that. So if so many people were abused, God was just letting everybody get abused like that? Of course not. Those predators made that choice, especially the child trafficking and serial rapists, serial killers for that matter. So let's go back to shame. Shame says, somehow I caused this. Well, when I work with this on a deep level with my clients, we usually do this in the sanctuary, which is a meditation on one of my other videos. So in the sanctuary, once you're in a really relaxed meditative state, you try to bring up the inner child that this happened to. Now, one of the things I usually ask my clients to do at some point in early therapy is to make an inner adult list. Now, this is a list that we hold up to the inner child to show that we're competent. So the inner adult list is any accomplishment or achievement I've ever made, whether that's graduating from high school, going to college, going to get a master's degree, what I do for a living, any extracurricular activities. So we look at education, we look at physical achievements, we look at emotional, psychological achievements, recovery, going to therapy, working on your issues all by yourself, anything that proves to yourself, this inner child, that you are capable of doing this. And usually when I'm working with a person on this, I have them say that Susie's done this many times with other people and she's helping me. So again, you don't go in there by yourself. You will never get to the depth of the emotional healing that you need to if you guide yourself into it. Going through the denial, the bargaining, the anger and rage, the grief and acceptance takes a long time. And if you're guided through it, you can get through it genuinely. forgiving the predator or the person who caused the trauma is usually a way to skip over the healing process. Sometimes abuse has been so terrible, I will tell a client that maybe they should leave the forgiveness to God and for them to get to acceptance of what happened. Acceptance, when you finally get there, is a feeling of no feeling. You're really not stuffing feelings, but you have accepted that it happened. And that is the time that you can look at forgiveness. Now, but that's when you've been through all those other feelings that are the same feelings that you go through in dealing with death. Denial, bargaining, anger, grief, shame, guilt, and then acceptance, because shame and guilt are part of the grief. So, and we don't go through them in steps. We go through them in like a spiral. And you touch on different same issues over and over in different ways and on deeper levels until finally you get to acceptance. Now, for me, this took a number of years to really get to acceptance. And the grief was the hardest part. Grieving, after the shame is healed, then comes the grief. So shame is also a protector. As long as I blame myself, I don't have to grieve what happened to me. I don't have to really let go of what happened. Many times an anxiety disorder or some of the other disorders, and I'm not talking about a brain disorder like bipolar ADHD, but sometimes a disorder is directly related to trauma that hasn't been resolved. And when that trauma is resolved, then sometimes that brain issue can be resolved. Now, you can't do your trauma work and resolve bipolar. Trust me, I know that very well. You can't make it resolve ADHD because those are brain issues. You can't get rid of a traumatic brain injury by doing this work, but you can get rid of some aspects of the brain. So, one of the things that I do is I have clients make this ideal adult list and make it as thorough as you can. And then I have them in their sanctuary, which is on another video, post this ideal adult list and add to it in that little sanctuary at any time they think of something else they've done. Now, I want them also to have this in writing so that I can have a copy of it and so that they can keep a copy of it, because you're going to be adding to it. And again, when you're working with trauma and shame, the inner child does not trust you because you've been blaming them, telling them it's our fault for so many years that they don't trust you at all yet. Many times when I work with somebody, I'll have them tell the inner child, Susie has done this with many people. You can trust Susie to help me. She's going to help me learn how to help you get over this. So that's one great way to do it, is my higher power is here. The angel, whichever angel you choose to call on, is here. Holy Spirit, whatever you choose to rely on, and whether it's the power of nature or whatever, it doesn't have to be a higher power. It can be something that you feel very connected to, higher learning, intimacy, anything like that. So shame says somehow it's your fault, and somehow you created something that, or you didn't get away, or you didn't stand up to the abuser. Now, I know some people, when they got to the age 17 or so, did stand up to the abuser and never got hurt again, and that needs to go on the top of your list. But before that age, they weren't ready. They would have gotten beaten or abused again or abused more. And for me, I would have gotten more abandonment, which is a terrible neglect for any child, whether they're a teenager or not. So the first thing I do is I have them visualize what age the abuse started and put that inner child in the sanctuary. And 0 to 10, how much do they blame that self? How much do you blame that kid? Be honest with yourself. I've heard a 10 before. I'm pretty sure mine was between a 7 to a 10. And then I want you to bring in, if you have children, bring in the child that reminds you of yourself the most, or a neighbor's child, a relative's child, any child that you can relate to. Put that child right next to the inner child. Pretend like the exact same thing happened to that child. Now, how much do you blame that child? I usually hear 0, because they usually say, I would say this to them. I would tell them it wasn't their fault. So we go back and forth between the the stand-in child, the neighbor, the relative, and the inner child. So why don't you say that to this kid? Now, when you're doing this, the brain starts to get a little bit confused. That's a great sign. That means the hold on the shame is lessening a little bit, and it's going to go down from a 10 to maybe just 1 or 2 points in the beginning. So then we keep looking at this rationale between why, and usually I'll have my clients say, keep following that why, what's the difference? And eventually they almost always get to the place where they say, because I could have done something. Well, why couldn't that other child have done something? Because they were too young. Why would you have been able to do something? And it gets confusing because their brain doesn't want to let go of it. Because if they let go of the shame, the absolute truth of what happened and the grief about what happened and the inability to understand it, how could this have happened to me? Why did this happen? All those feelings come back. So please don't do this on your own. You need a guide to do it. And they would be completely okay with that other child, the stand-in for the inner child, the neighbor, the relative, and they would comfort that child, and they would say, it wasn't your fault. Of course it wasn't. It was his fault or her fault. And going back, again, once they start this process, they're able to lower the shame a couple of points. And that's great. Sometimes that's all we do for the first time we work on the shame. When we come back to the shame again, when it's time, we look at more of the reasons why, and sometimes the shame has automatically lowered a few more points because they've taken it into their brain that they feel compassion and empathy for this other person, but they can't for themselves. If you feel blame, then that's about how little empathy you can feel also. This is a normal process. It is a way to protect ourselves from the grieving. The grieving is how we heal the trauma and the shame. So again, we go back into, and why is it your fault? I should have done this. And what would have happened if you did that? I would have gotten beaten because I got thrown against the wall. And what would have happened if you did this thing that you just said? It would have been worse. So now the brain is going, no, I'm not sure I should let go of this. So they start to get confused again. That's a good sign the shame is being relieved. Again, we go back to the stand-in, the neighbor, the relative, and that little kid, and they say, it's not their fault. I can see how it's not their fault. I would say this to them, you didn't deserve it. And then we go back to the inner child. And why doesn't the inner child deserve the same thing? Now, sometimes the shame lowers again even more, and we keep doing this and we keep working on it, and then we do some other emotional work related to that, whether it's anger work or more grief work, and little by little the shame goes down. I'll tell you a secret. When we bring the predator in a very far distance away from, in the sanctuary, away from the inner child, way far away, you can barely see them at all. And then you look at how much do you blame the predator. When you've gotten the shame down a little bit, how much do you blame that predator? Well, I forgive him. Well, a 3. And how much do you blame that kid? A 6. Now that sometimes allows the shame to lower just a little bit. Again, you need a guide to do this. And then we start working with blaming the predator. And I like to have the client allow me to say to the predator how angry I am at them and how protective I feel of this little child and how it wasn't her fault, which usually makes the inner child trust me even more. And then the adult starts to try to trust me more, and that helps the kid. Again, that might lower the shame a few more points. So when I say that, it gives the adult some permission to say that. Usually at that stage, it is very difficult for the adult to get really angry and say to the predator, how dare you? Now, if they were physically abused or sexually abused when they stood up for themselves, the adult is still stuck in that little child and needs a lot of support from me to be able to say that. It's okay, you can do it, I'm here, I've got your back, and then I'll say it again and again. Now again, this is work that you don't do on your own, but this is what I want you to understand, how you can get through shame. So having this guide who is completely not blaming the inner child, regardless of what happened, helps the adult of the patient begin to see how it wasn't their fault. And as you begin to blame this person, and we're not going to blame them for the rest of our lives, we're blaming them for what happened to the kid because they are to blame. And that is a really difficult thing to get through. So sometimes blame is only a 1 or a 2, but as we work on it, the blame will increase. As we work on it, the blame for the person who actually caused it will increase. And if we look at the stand-in for the inner child, the relative, the neighbor, whoever that other little kid is, and we say, how much would you blame this predator? How much would you blame this person if they did this to this friend or neighbors of yours? And they're a 10. It's a 10. They would blame him or her a 10. So then we go back to, and why isn't your parent or your relative or who did this to you blamed a level of a 10? And again, it's because somehow it's related to me. So we do this back and forth. This is a process I developed myself through my own therapy. We go back and forth with the blaming and the shaming in order to lower it a little bit at a time. Sometimes if the person has worked on it a lot, then they can lower it really quickly, and usually it takes a few sessions at least to get to the place. Now, one of the things I do when people are not ready to do anger work and to really confront the invisible predator with anger is I have them do what's called a silent scream. This is something you can do when you're ready to do towards a predator. A silent scream is you imagine that the predator or the abuser is way across from you on a mountain, and that you're on a mountaintop surrounded by me, your guardian angels, your higher power, any of your supportive friends and family. And you take a deep breath and you close your eyes and you imagine gathering up all the anger in your body and letting it out like that with your eyes closed, blowing all your anger across to that other mountaintop. Sorry for the dog. So she probably heard me blowing my anger. So you imagine, if you're ready and if you have anger available to you, and if you feel angry hearing this, that's a great exercise to do. Again, you just take a deep breath. You imagine that you're drawing anger up from your feet, the bottom of your toes, all the way up into your throat, and you breathe it out. This is a very safe way to get anger out when you're not ready. So again, please don't try this on your own. Please be willing to let someone guide you through it. Have them watch this video. That might be one of the best ways to do it. And again, look back to the inner child. Once you've done some of the anger work, I guarantee you those levels of shame will lower more than a couple of points. But if it's only 1 or 2 points, it's great. At this stage, if you know what tapping therapy is, that is a great way to release some of the shame and blame on yourself and release some anger. Tapping therapy, you can go to YouTube and put in tapping therapy for trauma. And it basically is having you tap on different acupuncture points, but you're using acupressure, and it allows emotions to run through your body. It's called tapping therapy for trauma, and might as well go to somebody who's already done a YouTube on it. So I hope that this was helpful to you. And if you ever need to leave me a text about this, it's 678-570-8169. Please only text me. You can email me at Suzy, S-U-Z-I, Marsh, M-A-R-S-H, .S as in Susie, M as in Marsh, at gmail.com. Thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video so I can upgrade my YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.